An ontological argument is a philosophical argument for the existence of God that uses ontology. Many arguments fall under the category of the ontological, and they tend to involve arguments about the state of being or existing. More specifically, ontological arguments tend to start with an a priori theory about the organization of the universe. If that organizational structure is true, the argument will provide reasons why God must exist. The first ontological argument in the Western Christian tradition was proposed by Anselm of Canterbury in his 1078 work Proslogion. Anselm defined God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived, and argued that this being must exist in the mind, even in the mind of the person who denies the existence of God. He suggested that, if the greatest possible being exists in the mind, it must also exist in reality. If it only exists in the mind, then an even greater being must be possible, one which exists both in the mind and in reality. Therefore, this greatest possible being must exist in reality. 17th-century French philosopher René Descartes deployed a similar argument. Descartes published several variations of his argument, each of which centered on the idea that God's existence is immediately inferable from a clear and distinct idea of a supremely perfect being. In the early 18th century, Gottfried Leibniz augmented Descartes' ideas in an attempt to prove that a supremely perfect being is a coherent concept. A more recent ontological argument came from Kurt Gödel, who proposed a formal argument for God's existence. Norman Malcolm revived the ontological argument in 1960 when he located a second, stronger ontological argument in Anselm's work. Alvin Plantinga challenged this argument and proposed an alternative based on modal logic. Attempts have also been made to validate Anselm's proof using an automated theorem prover. Other arguments have been categorized as ontological, including those made by Islamic philosopher Mullah Sadra. Since its proposal, few philosophical ideas have generated as much interest and discussion as the ontological argument. Nearly all of the great minds of Western philosophy have found the argument worthy of their attention and criticism. The general consensus is that the argument is erroneous. However, consensus as to the exact nature of the argument's error or errors has long proved elusive to the philosophical community. The first critic of the ontological argument was Anselm's contemporary, Gaunilo of Marmothiers. He used the analogy of a perfect island, suggesting that the ontological argument could be used to prove the existence of anything. This was the first of many parodies, all of which attempted to show that the argument has absurd consequences. Later, Thomas Aquinas rejected the argument on the basis that humans cannot know God's nature. Also, David Hume offered an empirical objection, criticizing its lack of evidential reasoning and rejecting the idea that anything can exist necessarily. Immanuel Kant's critique was based on what he saw as the false premise that existence is a predicate. He argued that existing adds nothing to the essence of a being, and thus a supremely perfect being can be conceived not to exist. Finally, philosophers including C.D. Broad dismissed the coherence of a maximally great being, proposing that some attributes of greatness are incompatible with others, rendering maximally great being incoherent. Classification. The traditional definition of an ontological argument was given by Immanuel Kant. He contrasted the ontological argument with the cosmological and physio-theoretical arguments. According to the Kantian view, ontological arguments are those founded on a priori reasoning. Graham Oppy, who elsewhere expressed the view that he see no urgent reason to depart from the traditional definition, defined ontological arguments as those that begin with nothing but analytic, a priori, and necessary premises, and conclude that God exists. Hoppe admitted, however, that not all of the traditional characteristics of an ontological argument are found in all ontological arguments, and, in his 2007 work Ontological Arguments and Belief in God, suggested that a better definition of an ontological argument would employ only considerations entirely internal to the theistic worldview. Hoppe subclassified ontological arguments into definitional, conceptual, modal, Meiningian, experiential, Mariological, higher order, or Hegelian categories, based on the qualities of the premises. He defined these qualities as follows. Definitional arguments invoke definitions. Conceptual arguments invoke the possession of certain kinds of ideas or concepts. Modal arguments consider possibilities. Meiningian arguments assert a distinction between different categories of existence. Experiential arguments employ the idea that God exists solely to those who have had experience of him, and Hegelian arguments are from Hegel. He later categorized Mariological as arguments that draw on the theory of the whole-part relation. William Lane Craig criticized Hoppe's study as too vague for useful classification. Craig argued that an argument can be classified as ontological if it attempts to deduce the existence of God, along with other necessary truths, from his definition. He suggested that proponents of ontological arguments would claim that, if one fully understood the concept of God, one must accept his existence. William L. Rowe defined ontological arguments as those that start from the definition of God and, using only a priori principles, conclude with God's existence. Development. Although the ontological argument may have been implicit in the works of Greek philosophers such as Plato and the Neoplatonists, the mainstream view is that the ontological argument was first clearly stated and developed by Anselm of Canterbury. Some scholars argued that the Islamic philosopher Avicenna developed a special kind of ontological argument before Anselm, but other scholars have doubted this position. Daniel Dombrowski marked three major stages in the development of the argument: Anselm's initial explicit formulation, the 18th-century criticisms of Kant and Hume, and the identification of a second ontological argument in Anselm's proslogion by 20th-century philosophers. Anselm, theologian and philosopher Anselm of Canterbury, proposed an ontological argument in the second and third chapters of his proslogion. Anselm's argument was not presented in order to prove God's existence. Rather, proslogion was a work of meditation in which he documented how the idea of God became self-evident to him. In Chapter 2 of the proslogion, Anselm defined God as a being than which no greater can be conceived. He suggested that even the fool can understand this concept, and this understanding itself means that the being must exist in the mind. The concept must exist either only in our mind, or in both our mind and in reality. If such a being exists only in our mind, then a greater being, that which exists in the mind and in reality, can be conceived. Therefore, if we can conceive of a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, it must exist in reality. Thus, a being than which nothing greater could be conceived, which Anselm defined as God, must exist in reality. Anselm's argument in Chapter 2 can be summarized as follows: it is a conceptual truth that God is a being than which none greater can be imagined. God exists as an idea in the mind. A being that exists as an idea in the mind and in reality is, other things being equal, greater than a being that exists only as an idea in the mind. Thus, if God exists only as an idea in the mind, then we can imagine something that is greater than God. But we cannot imagine something that is greater than God. Therefore, God exists. In Chapter 3, Anselm presented a further argument in the same vein. By definition, God is a being than which none greater can be imagined. A being that necessarily exists in reality is greater than a being that does not necessarily exist. Thus, by definition, if God exists as an idea in the mind but does not necessarily exist in reality, then we can imagine something that is greater than God. But we cannot imagine something that is greater than God. Thus, if God exists in the mind as an idea, then God necessarily exists in reality. God exists in the mind as an idea. Therefore, God necessarily exists in reality. This contains the notion of a being that cannot be conceived not to exist. He argued that if something can be conceived not to exist, then something greater can be conceived. Consequently, a thing than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot be conceived not to exist, and so it must exist. This can be read as a restatement of the argument in Chapter 2, although Norman Malcolm believed it to be a different, stronger argument. René Descartes composed a number of ontological arguments which differed from Anselm's formulation. Generally speaking, they are less formal arguments than natural intuition. Descartes wrote in the Fifth Meditation, "But, if the mere fact that I can produce from my thought the idea of something entails that everything that I clearly and distinctly perceive to belong to that thing really does belong to it, is not this a possible basis for another argument to prove the existence of God? Certainly, the idea of God, or a supremely perfect being, is one that I find within me just as surely as the idea of any shape or number, and my understanding that it belongs to his nature that he always exists is no less clear and distinct than is the case when I prove of any shape or number that some property belongs to its nature." Descartes argued that God's existence can be deduced from his nature, just as geometric ideas can be deduced from the nature of shapes. He used the deduction of the sizes of angles in a triangle as an example. He suggested that the concept of God is that of a supremely perfect being, holding all perfections. He seems to have assumed that existence is a predicate of a perfection. Thus, if the notion of God did not include existence, it would not be supremely perfect, as it would be lacking a perfection. Consequently, the notion of a supremely perfect God who does not exist, Descartes argues, is unintelligible. Therefore, according to his nature, God must exist. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz saw a problem with Descartes' ontological argument, that Descartes had not asserted the coherence of a supremely perfect being. He proposed that, unless the coherence of a supremely perfect being could be demonstrated, the ontological argument fails. Leibniz saw perfection as impossible to analyze. Therefore, it would be impossible to demonstrate that all perfections are incompatible. He reasoned that all perfections can exist together in a single entity, and that Descartes' argument is still valid. Mullah Sadra was an Iranian Shia Islamic philosopher who was influenced by earlier Muslim philosophers such as Avicenna and Suhrawardi, as well as the Sufi metaphysician Ibn Arabi. Sadra discussed Avicenna's arguments for the existence of God, claiming that they were not a priori. He rejected the argument on the basis that existence precedes essence, or that the existence of human beings is more fundamental than their essence. Sadra put forward a new argument, known as Sedekian argument, or argument of the righteous. The argument attempts to prove the existence of God through the reality of existence, and to conclude with God's pre-eternal necessity. In this argument, a thing is demonstrated through itself, and a path is identical with the goal. In other arguments, the truth is attained from an external source, such as from the possible to the necessary, from the originated to the eternal origin, or from motion to the unmoved mover. In the argument of the righteous, there is no middle term other than the truth. His version of the ontological argument can be summarized as follows: there is existence. Existence is a perfection above which no perfection may be conceived. God is perfection and perfection in existence. Existence is a singular and simple reality. There is no metaphysical pluralism. That singular reality is graded in intensity in a scale of perfection. That scale must have a limit point, a point of greatest intensity and of greatest existence. Hence God exists. Mullah Sadra describes this argument in his main work Al-Isfar al-Arbor as follows: existence is a single, objective and simple reality, and there is no difference between its parts, unless in terms of perfection and imperfection, strength and weakness, and the culmination of its perfection, where there is nothing more perfect, is its independence from any other thing. Nothing more perfect should be conceivable, as every imperfect thing belongs to another thing and needs to become perfect. And, as it has already been explicated, perfection is prior to imperfection, actuality to potency, and existence to non-existence. Also, it has been explained that the perfection of a thing is the thing itself, and not a thing in addition to it. Thus, either existence is independent of others or it is in need of others. The former is the necessary, which is pure existence. Nothing is more perfect than him, and in him there is no room for non-existence or imperfection. The latter is other than him, and is regarded as his acts and effects, and for other than him there is no subsistence, unless through him. For there is no imperfection in the reality of existence, and imperfection is added to existence only because of the quality of being caused, as it is impossible for an effect to be identical with its cause in terms of existence. Kurt Gödel, mathematician Kurt Gödel, provided a formal argument for God's existence. The argument was constructed by Gödel but not published until long after his death. He provided a logically valid argument based on modal logic. He uses the conception of properties, ultimately concluding with God's existence. Definition 1. X is God-like if and only if X has as essential properties those and only those properties which are positive. Definition 2. A is an essence of X if and only if for every property B, X has B necessarily if and only if A entails B. Definition 3. X necessarily exists if and only if every essence of X is necessarily exemplified. Axiom 1. If a property is positive, then its negation is not positive. Axiom 2. Any property entailed by i.e. strictly implied by a positive property is positive. Axiom 3. The property of being godlike is positive. Axiom 4. If a property is positive, then it is necessarily positive. Axiom 5. Necessarily existence is positive. Axiom 6. For any property P, if P is positive, then being necessarily P is positive. Theorem 1. If a property is positive, then it is consistent, i.e. possibly exemplified. Corollary 1. The property of being godlike is consistent. Theorem 2. If something is godlike, then the property of being godlike is an essence of that thing. Theorem 3. Necessarily, the property of being godlike is exemplified. Gödel defined being godlike as having every positive property. He left the term positive undefined. Gödel proposed that it is understood in an aesthetic and moral sense, or alternatively as the opposite of privation. He warned against interpreting positive as being morally or aesthetically good, as this includes negative characteristics. Instead, he suggested that positive should be interpreted as being perfect or purely good, without negative characteristics. Gödel's listed theorems follow from the axioms, so most criticisms of the theory focus on those axioms of the assumptions made. Hoppe argued that Gödel gives no definition of positive properties. He suggested that if these positive properties form a set, there is no reason to believe that any such such set exists which is theologically interesting, or that there is only one set of positive properties which is theologically interesting. Modal versions of the ontological argument. Modal logic deals with the logic of possibility as well as necessity. Paul Oppenheimer and Edward N. Zalta note that, for Anselm's Proslogue in Chapter 2, many recent authors have interpreted this argument as a modal one. Quote, in the phrase that than which none greater can be conceived, the word can could be construed as referring to a possibility. Nevertheless, the authors write that the logic of the ontological argument itself doesn't include inferences based on this modality. Quote, however, there have been newer, avowedly modal logic versions of the ontological argument, and on the application of this type of logic to the argument, James Franklin Harris writes, different versions of the ontological argument, the so-called modal versions of the argument, which arguably avoid the part of Anselm's argument that treats existence as a predicate, began to emerge. The of these forms of defense of the ontological argument has been the most significant development. Hartshorne and Malcolm. Charles Hartshorne and Norman Malcolm are primarily responsible for introducing modal versions of the argument into the contemporary debate. Both claimed that Anselm had two versions of the ontological argument, the second of which was a modal logic version. According to James Harris, this version is represented by Malcolm thus: if it can be conceived at all, it must exist. For no one who denies or doubts the existence of a being a greater than which is inconceivable, denies or doubts that if it did exist its non-existence, either in reality or in the understanding, would be impossible. For otherwise it would not be of being a greater than which cannot be conceived, but as to whatever can be conceived but does not exist. If it were to exist, its non-existence, either in reality or in the understanding, would be possible. Therefore, if a being a greater than which cannot be conceived, can't even be conceived, it must exist. Hartshorne says that, for Anselm, necessary existence is a superior manner of existence to ordinary, contingent existence, and that ordinary, contingent existence is a defect. For Hartshorne, both Hume and Kant focused only upon whether what exists is greater than what does not exist. However, Anselm's point is that what exists and cannot not exist is greater than that which exists and cannot exist. Quote, this avoids the question of whether or not existence is a predicate, referring to the two ontological arguments proposed by Anselm in chapters 2 and 3 of his Proslogue. Malcolm supported Kant's criticism of Anselm's argument in chapter 2, that existence cannot be a perfection of something. However, he identified what he sees as the second ontological argument in chapter 3, which is not susceptible to such criticism. In Anselm's second argument, Malcolm identified two key points. First, that a being whose non-existence is logically impossible is greater than a being whose non-existence is logically possible, and second, that God is a being than which a greater cannot be conceived. Malcolm supported that definition of God and suggested that it makes the proposition of God's existence a logically necessarily true statement. Thus, while rejecting the idea of existence itself being a perfection, Malcolm argued that necessary existence is a perfection. This, he argued, proved the existence of an unsurpassably great necessary being. Jordan Sobel writes that Malcolm is incorrect in assuming that the argument he is expounding is to be found entirely in Proslogue in chapter 3. Anselm intended in Proslogue in 3 not an independent argument for the existence of God, but continuation of the argument of Proslogue in 2. Alvin Plantinga, Christian analytic philosopher Alvin Plantinga, criticized Malcolm's and Hartshorne's arguments, and offered an alternative. He argued that, if Malcolm does prove the necessary existence of the greatest possible being, it follows that there is a being which exists in all worlds whose greatness in some worlds is not surpassed. It does not, he argued, demonstrate demonstrate that such a being has unsurpassed greatness in this world. In an attempt to resolve this problem, Plantinga differentiated between greatness and excellence. A being's excellence in a particular world depends only on its properties in that world. A being's greatness depends on its properties in all worlds. Therefore, the greatest possible being must have maximal excellence in every possible world. Plantinga then restated Malcolm's argument, using the concept of maximal greatness. He argued that it is possible for a being with maximal greatness to exist, so a being with maximal greatness exists in a possible world. If this is the case, then a being with maximal greatness exists in every world, and therefore in this world. The conclusion relies on a form of modal axiom S5, which states that if something is possibly true, then its possibility is necessary. Plantinga's version of S5 suggests that to say that P is possibly necessarily true is to say that, with regard to one world, it is true at all worlds, but in that case it is true at all worlds, and so it is simply necessary. A version of his argument is as follows. A being has maximal excellence in a given possible world W if and only if it is omnipotent, omniscient and wholly good in W, and a being has maximal greatness if it has maximal excellence in every possible world. It is possible that there is a being that has maximal greatness. Therefore, possibly, it is necessarily true that an omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good being exists. Therefore, it is necessarily true that an omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good being exists. Therefore, an omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good being exists. Plantinga argued that, although the first premise is not rationally established, it is not contrary to reason. Michael Martin argued that, if certain components of perfection are contradictory, such as omnipotence and omniscience, then the first premise is contrary to reason. Martin also proposed parodies of the argument, suggesting that the existence of anything can be demonstrated with Plantinga's argument, provided it is defined as perfect or special in every possible world. Another Christian apologist, William Lane Craig, characterizes Plantinga's argument in a slightly different way. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. Therefore, a maximally great being exists. According to Craig, premises are relatively uncontroversial among philosophers, but the epistemic entertainability of premise does not guarantee its metaphysical possibility. Furthermore, Richard M. Gale argued that premise 3, the possibility premise, begs the question. He stated that one only has the epistemic right to accept the premise if one understands the nested modal operators, and that if one understands them within the system S5, without which the argument fails, then one understands that possibly necessarily is in essence the same as necessarily. Thus the premise begs the question because the conclusion is embedded within it. On S5 systems in general, James Garson writes that the words necessarily and possibly have many different uses, so the acceptability of axioms for modal logic depends on which of these uses we have in mind. Sankara's dictum, an approach to supporting the possibility premise in Plantinga's version of the argument, was attempted by Alexander R. Pruss. He started with the 8th–9th century AD Indian philosopher Sankara's dictum that if something is impossible, we cannot have a perception that it is the case. It follows that if we have a perception that P, then even though it might not be the case that P, it is at least the case that possibly P. If mystics in fact perceive the existence of a maximally great being, it follows that the existence of a maximally great being is at least possible. Automated reasoning. Paul Oppenheimer and Edward Salter used an automated theorem prover 9 to validate Anselm's ontological thesis. Prover 9 subsequently discovered a simpler, formally valid ontological argument from a single non-logical premise.